The U.S. Department of Defense defines terrorism as the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to inculcate fear intended to coerce or intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, or ideological. Acts of terrorism can include threats of terrorism, kidnappings, hijackings, assassinations, bomb threats, bombings, suicide bombings, cyber attacks, and the use of biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. High-risk targets include military and civilian government buildings, international airports, large cities, and high-profile landmarks. The two types of terrorism include international terrorism, which is violence committed by individuals or groups who are associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations and nations. The second is domestic terrorism. These are acts of violence committed by individuals or groups in order to further ideological goals which stem from domestic influences, which can be of religious, political, social, racial, or environmental nature. Factors that have contributed to the evolution of terroristic threat on domestic and international fronts include lone offenders and in the internet and social media. Lone offenders includes individuals who mobilize to violence quickly, independent of any direction from a terrorist organization or group. This can be challenging to identify and investigate due to the lack of affiliation with the group. They do, however, align with the group's ideology or beliefs. The internet and social media includes publications, online images, and videos which have enabled international and domestic extremists to develop an extensive presence on the internet. This makes it easier for the group to recruit individuals. Social media can give virtual access to individuals in the U.S. to enable homeland attacks. During the course of American history, terrorist attacks have ended the innocent lives of many, hurt the economy, and forced America to implement change through the creation of government departments, government agencies, and legislation. Goals of terrorists include to create fear among the people, attain publicity for their causes, destroy the public's sense of security in places that are most familiar to them, and they hope that the fear, panic, and terror of these acts will convince the population to pressure political leaders into certain political ends. Number 10, the Centennial Olympic Park bombing. This event was a domestic terrorist pipe bombing attack in Georgia on July 27, 1996, during the Summer Olympics. The blast directly killed one person and injured 111. There is one suspect in the case, Richard Jewell, the security guard who alerted the police of the bomb before it exploded, but he was innocent. Despite his innocence, his life and career were ruined after the plot was pinned on him. In 1998, Eric Rudolph was identified as the suspect in the bombing, and in 2013, he confessed to a total of 4 bombings. The saga of Jewell raises the question what we, as an industry, and to a wider extent as a society, learn from the destruction of a man's name. Number 9, the Overland Park Jewish Center shooting. Fraser Glenn Miller Jr., an American domestic terrorist and former KKK leader, killed 3 people at a Jewish community center in suburban Kansas City in 2014. In the parking lot, he opened fire on 69-year-old William Corbin and his 14-year-old grandson. After this incident, he drove over to the nearby retirement home and shot 53-year-old Terry LaManna, who was visiting her mother. Number 8, the Boston Marathon bombing. On April 15, 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs, which were hidden in the backpacks among the crowds, exploded along the finish line on Boylston Street. Over 260 people were wounded, 16 people lost their legs, and 3 people were killed. The 2 suspects, Tamerlan Tsarnaev and Jahar Tsarnaev, stated that the bombings were committed in retaliation for U.S. wars in Muslim countries. Many investigators believe the brothers were motivated by extremist Islamic beliefs. One major change that came to the FBI as a result of the Boston bombings is routine and periodic reassessment of counterterrorism cases. Number 7, 16th Street Baptist Church bombing by the KKK. The bomb went off on September 15, 1963, while members were attending Sunday school and getting ready for church services. After the bomb exploded on the east side of the building, the bodies of 4 girls were found beneath the rubble in the church basement. Thomas Edwin Blayton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambers, and Bobby Frank Cherry were members of the KKK who were responsible for this attack. Number 6, the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. On February 26, 1993, a truck bomb exploded in a parking garage under the World Trade Center. 6 people were killed and overall, 1,000 were injured. This was an indication to the Diplomatic Security Service that terrorism was evolving to a transnational phenomenon. DSS quickly identified a group of Middle Eastern radicals as those responsible for the attacks. The fact that Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda had ties to the bombing did not become clear until 1996. The bombing was the first time Americans became aware of the dangers of international terrorism. In the years that followed the bombing, security in Lower Manhattan began to change. Steel barriers were added outside of buildings, roads near federal buildings were restricted, and the steps of City Hall were closed to the public unless people went through the security booths. Number 5. The USS Cole bombing. This was an attack by Muslim militants associated with Al-Qaeda against the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer, on October 12, 2000. Suicide terrorists exploded a small boat next to the USS Cole as it was refueling in the Yemeni port of Aden. 17 American sailors were killed from the blast and 39 were injured due to the 40-foot hole near the waterline of the vessel. Number 4. The Oklahoma City bombing. This was the worst act of homegrown terrorism in the nation's history and the deadliest attack on U.S. soil until the attacks of 9/11. On the morning of April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh, an ex-Army soldier, parked his rented truck in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The powerful bomb inside his vehicle exploded and reduced one-third of the building to debris. In this tragedy, 168 people lost their lives, 19 of which were children. Timothy believed in the views of the Patriot movement, which feared plots of the U.S. government and corporate elites. He claimed that the bombing of OKC was to avenge the 70 deaths at the Waco siege of the Branch Davidian religious sect just 2 years earlier. As a result of this bombing, the U.S. Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. Number 3. U.S. embassies in East Africa bombed. On August 7, 1998, a truck bomb exploded outside of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. Just minutes later, another truck bomb exploded outside of the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam. These dual terrorist attacks killed 224 people, 12 of which were Americans, and wounded more than 4,500. Al-Qaeda was responsible for these attacks, and on August 20th, President Bill Clinton ordered missiles to be launched into bin Laden's terrorist training camps in Afghanistan and against a pharmaceutical plant where bin Laden made his chemical weapons. Number 2. U.S. and French military barracks in Beirut hit by car bombs. On October 23, 1983, a suicide bomber drove his truck into U.S. Marine Corps barracks at the Beirut International Airport, which killed 220 Marines, 18 sailors, and 3 soldiers. Just a few minutes later, an additional bomb went off after the bomb drove into the French barracks, which killed 58 additional people. The Marines were placed here in the first place as a part of a peacekeeping force that was trying to negotiate a truce between Christian and Muslim Lebanese factions. The next February, all troops withdrew from Lebanon. An unknown group calling itself Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility for the bombings. Number 1. 9/11. 19 militants who associated with the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes on which they carried out 4 suicide attacks on U.S. targets. One plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, PA. Another hit the Pentagon, and 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The hijackers, Islamic terrorists who were associated with the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization of Osama bin Laden, ended almost 3,000 innocent lives that day, and almost 10,000 were treated for injuries, many of which were very severe. This resulted in the passing of the Aviation and Transportation Security Acts of 2001. 9/11 was the most impactful because it was the deadliest terrorist plot in American history. This was when the War on Terror began. President George W. Bush made a case for a new kind of military response, a wide-ranging global war on terror which would begin with Al-Qaeda and end until every terrorist group of global reach was found and defeated. The ever-present shadows of 9/11 kept U.S. troops in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. Because of 9/11, air travel was transformed. Before 9/11, people did not have to buy a ticket to wander around airports. There were no background checks on employees, and checked baggage was never scanned. 9/11 was also the cause for the creation of the Transportation Security Administration. After 9/11, anti-Muslim violence grew. Many people in America and worldwide associated 9/11 attacks with Islam and wanted revenge on anyone who looked remotely Muslim. The number of anti-Muslim attacks in 2000 was 12, and after 9/11, that number jumped to 93. After security fears raised due to 9/11, the Homeland Security Act of 2002 created the Department of Homeland Security, which was signed into law by President George W. Bush on November 25, 2002. Its responsibilities today include border security, disaster relief and prevention, immigration and customs, and preventing terror attacks. Overall, their duties are wide-ranging, but their goal is clear: to keep America safe. Increased terrorism in the U.S. led to the creation of the Transportation Security Administration. This was a new federal agency authorized by Congress in November of 2001. It introduced extensive new security protocols. Tickets and IDs became required for screening, laptops had to be removed from carry-ons, shoes had to be taken off, liquids were restricted to ounce containers, and full-body scanners were implemented into the screening processes. TSA officers were trained in behavior detection to recognize suspicious activity. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in 1996 was passed as a result of the bombing of Oklahoma City. U.S. Congress passed this act, which tightened the standards for habeas corpus in the U.S., as well as legislation designed to increase the protection around federal buildings to deter future terrorist attacks. Congress intended to give prisoners one and only one chance to raise a collateral challenge in federal court. Prisoners who want to file a successive challenge may do so only with the permission of a federal appellate court. The Aviation and Transportation Security Acts of 2001 were designed to improve the security of transportation systems in the U.S., with an emphasis on airport security. ATSA outlined procedures for hiring and training screening personnel and mandates that the cockpit doors be closed and reinforced during flight. After 9/11, numerous Wall Street institutions were evacuated and the market fell 684 points. The New York City economy lost 143,000 jobs, and the cost to clean Ground Zero was $750 million. The War on Terror cost $2,000 billion from 2001 to 2020. This was launched by President George W. Bush in response to the 9/11 attacks. It includes the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, and these wars added $2.4 trillion to the debt as of the fiscal year 2020 budget. This war significantly increases the base budget for the Department of Defense. Since 2001, the War on Terror has added almost $2 trillion to the U.S. debt, which is more than 35% of the debt. Taxpayers have spent more than $1.52 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The real cost of the War on Terror includes the jobs lost that those funds could have created. Every $1 billion spent on defense could have created 8,555 jobs and added $565 million to the economy.